You've made it a long way in this important conversation about abuse prevention. Our time together has almost come to an end. But before we wrap up, we have one last topic we need to cover. And although it's the last, it might be the most important. This session will cover what you need to know about reporting abuse so that you can ensure you're doing everything you should to help create a safe environment for the children in your care.
So this last topic is all about reporting abuse, which includes reporting to the authorities and reporting to supervisors. First, let's talk about reporting to the authorities. It's important to note that every state in the U.S. has legislation that covers the requirement to report. These pieces of legislation vary from state to state, but they do have some things in common. Some of these commonalities are that they describe what abuse and neglect are, who is required to report, and to whom that report needs to be made. And usually there is a time frame within which that report needs to be made. This leads me to a term that may be new to you, and that is mandatory reporter. Mandatory reporters are the people who are required by law to report abuse. Oftentimes, legislation will make a list of who these specific people are, while some states simply mandate that all adults in the respective state are considered mandatory reporters. Anyone who is not a mandatory reporter under the law is a permissive reporter. In some states, all adults are mandatory reporters, but in states that specifically list who is required to report, anyone not on that list is a permissive reporter and encouraged to report. The various state laws will also contain some instructions about how a matter is to be reported, to whom it needs to be reported, as well as whether or not an oral report needs to be followed by a written report. In some states, some licensed professionals have additional reporting obligations described in their state's laws. The point is this: though the laws from state to state have similarities, every state has its own legislation. And it's important that you understand what that legislation is in the state where you live or in the state where you're serving children. You must also understand that these pieces of legislation are constantly changing. So it's not enough to understand what the law says today. You have to know what the law is and then periodically check to see if there's been any changes in legislation. Also keep in mind that many organizations may have staff members who are mandatory reporters and some who are permissive reporters, like a camp in some states, where the nurse is under different requirements than a registration volunteer. Understand the law and the obligations of your organization's staff. Remember, when in doubt, report. Let's talk about what to report. The various laws require that we report suspicions of abuse and neglect. First of all, do not miss the requirement to report suspicions, not confirmations. We're not required to investigate as a condition of reporting or try to verify, get proof, or witnesses. The laws require us to report suspicions of abuse, which is intentionally broad. Additionally, abuse is broadly described, oftentimes including sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. But as it relates to sexual abuse and the requirement to report, keep the definition in mind that we discussed at the very beginning of this training: any tricked, forced, manipulated, or coerced sexual activity for the pleasure of the abuser. And remember, this definition is very broad by design. So the best rule to follow is the one I mentioned earlier: when in doubt, report.
In addition, where reporting is concerned, a good rule of thumb is don't let the sun set on it. If it came to your attention today, report it today. In every state, both mandatory and permissive reporters enjoy civil and criminal immunities when a report is made in good faith. These immunities protect the reporter from lawsuits and criminal prosecution so long as the report was made in good faith. And a good faith report is any report made without actual malicious intent or with information known to be false. In the law firm, we occasionally receive a phone call from an individual who asks about reporting requirements and says, "What if I'm wrong about this suspicion of abuse or allegation?" So the whole point of legal reporting requirements is to protect the child. Essentially, the legislature has determined that the safety of the child outweighs any inconvenience to the accused adult or an aggressor child. For reporting purposes, an allegation is a reportable event, whether the allegation is believed to be credible or not. In other words, for purposes of reporting, an allegation should be reported as if it's believed to be credible. It is not our job to investigate to determine credibility. That's the work of trained professionals in law enforcement or child protective agencies. Finally, be aware that all governmental entities have criminal ramifications for failure to report. When a mandatory reporter fails to report a suspicion or allegation of sexual abuse, it's not just harmful to the child, it's a crime.
We've discussed reporting to the authorities. Now let's discuss the need to report to supervisors. Now, first and foremost, if there's a circumstance that leads to a report to the authorities, let a supervisor know so he or she can take steps to protect the child as well as any others in the program who may be at risk. But for those concerns that don't necessarily rise to the level of reporting to the authorities, there still exists the importance of creating a culture of communication. In other words, everyone who wears a name tag should understand that the lines of communication are open with an expectation that they will be utilized, especially about any possible grooming behavior. This means you should communicate with leaders or supervisors when you see policy violations, especially violations that line up with some of these common grooming behaviors or any phase of the grooming process. It's important to remember, this is not a witch hunt. It's simply consistent with the principle that if you see something, say something. If we all have a responsibility to communicate policy violations to supervisors or administrators, that leader can take the collective information and see a bigger picture such that problematic behavior can be addressed before it becomes harmful or abusive. Like I mentioned before, if you see something, say something. But remember, the goal here is to replace misconceptions with good information because what we believe also shapes what we see. And we have to first see the problem before we can act to protect the children in our care.